Henry Miller, an American novelist whose books, widely censored, widely read despite the censorship, and eventually widely prized as an iconoclastic celebration of life, died Saturday at his home in Pacific Palisades, California. He was 88. The cause of death was not reported, but Mr. Miller had suffered in recent years from circulatory disorders. For years, Mr. Miller knew as much notoriety as fame. His most famous books were two autobiographical novels, Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn. They are garrulous, sometimes realistic, and often funny, but they are most often remembered for sex. Sex in real life, sex in fantasies, sex at all time and in all kind of places, sex in absurd, shocking four-letters words. Cancer were published by the Obelisk Press in Paris in 1934. Capricorn was published by the same house in 1934. Neither appeared in the United States until the 1961, when the Grove Press brought them out in the paperback edition. It was not until 1963 that the U.S. Supreme Court let stand a ruling by the Supreme Court of California that they were not obscene. From the 1930s until their publication in this country, the two books were among the items most frequently smuggled into the United States by persons returning from France. In fact, Mr. Miller wrote more than 50 books. Besides Cancer and Capricorn, several are autobiographical, and this includes The Rosy Crucifixion, a trilogy made up of 3 works that originally were published separately, Sexus, Plexus, and Nexus. Mr. Miller also wrote about travel, painting himself painted, and his watercolors appeared in many shows, his friends, and other topics. He became one of the most widely read American authors of this country, but he sometimes feared that he was read primarily because of his earlier notoriety. "I am being accepted for the wrong reasons," he once said in an interview with the Paris Review. "It is a sensational affair. It doesn't mean that I'm appreciated for my true worth." Critics and friends did not share this doubts. The writer's Anis Nin characterized his work as a wild extravagance and mad gaiety, a nerve, a gusto, at times almost a delirium. Norman Mailer once said Mr. Miller's books had all the papability of a huge elm uprooted in your backyard. The English writer Lawrence Durrell described Mr. Miller's novels as having an Elizabethan quality, a rare tonic vitality which comes from the savage health of its creator. Durrell added that the autobiographical novels were one of the great liberating confessions of our age. Robert Shattuck, a critic for the New York Times, wrote that the best way to read Cancer and Capricorn was to treat them as a lark whose meandering, impulsive story challenges sham, seriousness, earning a living, automatism, and unworthiness of self. The pace and judged action offer a superb entertainment that brings in us, as it goes, Jeremiah's casual lyrics and sudden reaches toward the spiritual core of life. Mr. Miller often was compared to Walt Whitman, and himself acknowledged his debt to the American poet. "My loyalty and adoration have been constant for the same man all throughout my life," he said. Whitman, Emerson, Thoreau, Rabelais, above all, I still think that no one has ever had a larger, freer, healthier view of man and his universe than Walt Whitman. On the question of sex in his own books, Mr. Miller said, "I wrote about sex because It was such a big part of my life. Sex was always the domination thing. People had said that I throw in juices passages just to keep the reader awake. That is not true. My everyday life was full of this objectionable, questionable material. He drew a distinction between his own work and what he regarded as the prurience of many more recent writers. Recent books, he said, are merely titillating to teenagers. I was accused more of obscenity than pornography. I could be bruising, damaging, helling, but not titillating. Today writers are just flirting with sex. Henry Valentin Miller was born in New York on December 26 in 1891. His parents were second-generation German Americans, and the family spoke German at home as much as English. When Henry was a small child, the family moved to the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, and Mr. Miller retained a Brooklyn accent for the rest of his life. By his own account, his childhood was not happy. He once described his mother as a rigid, puritanical woman who wanted him to follow in his father's footsteps and be a tailor. She disapproved of his ambition of being a writer. The young Miller held a series of odd jobs in New York, and for a while he even tried to work with his father. During World War I, he was a clerk in the Old War Department. In quest of excitement, he took a job as a reporter on the Washington Post, but quit after 3 days because he did not like his assignment. A search of the Post's file discovered no Henry Miller bylines. Back in New York, he went to work for the Western Union Telegraph Co. His work was to hire messengers, and he described his years there in the Capricorn. In 1917, he married the first of his 5 wives, Beatrice Sayles Wichkens. In 1923, he met his second wife, June Edith Smith, a Broadway taxi dancer. He divorced his first wife, married Miss Smith, and tried writing full-time, living on his wife's earnings. The couple spent several months in Paris in 1928 and in 1929. A year later, Mr. Miller returned to Paris alone. He lived there for the next 9 years. His existence, he had written, was largely hand-to-mouth, jobs being few and far between. He completed Cancer in 1932, but it was not until 2 years later that it was published. In 1949, he visited Greece, and this trip provides him with the material for his own favorite book, The Colossus of Marousi. The voyage to Greece was the apex of my happiness, my joy, a very great eye-opener, he said in an interview with the Post in 1977. What one admires that is a poor people who are happy compared to us who are miserable with our riches. Mr. Miller returned to the United States after the outbreak of World War II. For several years, he lived a modest home in the Big Sur section of California. He moved to Pacific Palisades in the mid of 1960s because he said his presence in the growing art colony around Big Sur had become too well known and brought too many visitors. In 1944, at the beginning of his Big Sur years, Mr. Miller married Janina Lepska. They were divorced in 1952, and the following year he married Eve McClure. The marriage ended in a divorce in 1962. Shortly thereafter, he married Hoki Tokuda, a Japanese entertainer who played the piano in the nightclubs. He and Miss Tokuda had been separated for several years at the time of Mr.'s death. Mr. Miller's honors included membership in the National Institute of Art and Letters and the Legion of Honor of France. His survivors includes a daughter, Barbara, by his fifth marriage and two children by the third marriage, Anthony and Valentine. In what could serve as a summing up of his life and work, he once said, "I found it easier to give the truth about the ugly side of my nature than the good. I wrote all these autobiographical books not because I think myself as such an important person, but this will make you laugh, because I thought when I began what I was telling the story of the most tragic suffering any man had endured. As I got on with, I realized that I was only an amateur at suffering."